She'd been shot. She had been shot.
911, go ahead.
I was hallucinating.
You were hallucinating?
She screamed and screamed
And I saw a body.
she was dead.
He's now waiting for his second victim.
For many people who grew up with siblings, their brothers and sisters are like their built-in best friends. They're who you play with, fight with, and learn from. They are the people you can count on to be there for you during the hard times in life and celebrate the good times. They are the people who are supposed to be there for you, and vice versa. For most people, it is important to keep their siblings from any harm, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional. The thought of causing them any real harm has likely never crossed their mind, and certainly most people have never and will never ever consider the thought of taking the life of their sibling, the person they grew up with and were taught to love. But unfortunately, some people do kill their siblings. It's happened before and will likely happen again. The following stories tell the tale of 3 disturbed teenagers who killed their own sisters. One of the killings seemed to be completely out of the blue. One of the killers was still a child himself, and the other was a real-life Satanist. The year was 1998, and Jennifer Jenkins of Canada was a kind, caring 18-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. She had loving parents, Brian and Leslie, and an older brother named Mason. Jennifer should have lived a long, happy life. She should have had the chance to graduate from college, pursue her dreams, and start a family someday if she wanted to. But unfortunately, these things were taken from her because her life was tragically cut short by somebody she should have been able to trust to protect her. This is a case that is sure to rock you to your core. Jennifer was killed in her own home in a horrific act of violence.
She'd been shot. She had been shot in the head. Our lives changed horribly from that time on.
What was left of Jennifer's shattered family had to try and pick up the pieces after the tragedy. Unfortunately, this would be nearly impossible as Jennifer's brother Mason, who was 20 years old at the time, was charged with her death and later convicted. But did he really do it? Was it on purpose? And if so, what was the motive? These are all questions that Leslie and Brian were left with. Jennifer had been shot not only in the head, but in the chest as well.
She screamed and screamed, and there's this, and there's a trail down the basement steps. So I went down the basement, and that's when I saw Jennifer.
From the very beginning, Mason denied ever hurting his sister. Today, he still maintains his innocence. He was emotional when questioned by police and seemed to love Jennifer.
Should have been me. She never did anything to anybody in her whole life. She was 18 and she was going places.
Mason's parents have never witnessed their son be violent, and there weren't signs that would ever cause them to suspect him. So they immediately questioned whether he was really the one who did it.
I just can't imagine. I can't imagine that he would actually hurt Jennifer.
But are Mason's parents just protecting their only remaining child, or is it possible that Mason is actually innocent? On the night that Jennifer was killed, both she and Mason had been at home, while Leslie and Brian were at the mechanic. They had spoken to Mason earlier in the day, and he seemed fine. When the parents of the two arrived back home, they both went in different directions in the house.
One way, I went the other, and then we called for the children, and the house was fairly dark. Nobody answered us at the time. And then finally I came to the basement and decided that we would have a look downstairs to see where they were and what was going on. So I went partway down the stairs and looked to my left, and I saw a body.
Help would be called soon after. We need help. My husband can't. There's in the basement. It looks like 2 teenagers, Leslie began. There was a lot of confusion about what was going on, and Leslie and Brian were in shock. In fact, it took Brian a moment to realize that the wounded person was his daughter. As they tried to piece together what had happened while on the phone with the dispatcher explained that they need to try to locate Mason because he could be in danger if an intruder was still in the house. But Mason was not in the house. In fact, he was fleeing the police on horseback.
I went to my cousin's house, and so I saddled her horse. But I wasn't really trying to hide, and I wasn't really trying to get away. You know, when you ride a 1,200-pound animal through the middle of the city, across 3 or 4 major intersections. You're not really trying to hide.
Brian was asked to come in just a couple of hours after everything happened and answer any questions he could about what had happened. When he was asked what his daughter was wearing when he went downstairs, Brian tried to recall, but all he could think about was the amount of gore that covered his daughter.
It was like her corduroy jacket was soaked. I tried to stop, but she was dead.
Brian was struggling to wrap his head around what he had experienced.
We haven't done nothing. We don't deserve this.
Meanwhile, Mason decided to check back in on his house, but there were police everywhere. He needed time to think. Mason did have somewhat of a criminal record related to theft, but there was nothing suggesting violence in his history. It just didn't make sense. Mason was arrested not long after Jennifer's death. "I really want to be with my family," he told police. Mason claimed that he had seen a white van pull up to the driveway of his home. He said that 4 men, 2 of them armed, came out of the vehicle and entered the house. He said that they kidnapped him and put him in a van. 2 of them were carrying guns on them. "I don't know what kind," he said. Police didn't think the story made sense, and they began to believe Mason did it. His parents didn't know what to believe. They knew Mason and Jennifer loved each other and he had no reason to hurt her. They eventually decided that they would stand by their son. It was all too overwhelming.
At that point, it was, we can't deal with this, whether you're innocent or not, we just have to wait. Because at that point, we were also trying to deal with the death of Jennifer and the arrangements and making a funeral and a tribute to her while we're still being questioned by the police.
The trial against Mason was brutal, and it went on for 3 years. People who Leslie and Brian considered friends cut them off completely, and many people judged them for standing by Mason. They would eventually find out more information about the night their daughter was killed. For example, they learned that she was while sitting in a chair eating popcorn and watching television. Mason would be sentenced to prison and would appeal for several years after. He struggled to know what to say to investigators, not wanting to dig himself into a deeper hole.
I didn't murder anybody. I got no reason to lie to you.
Mason continued to say that he loved his sister and that she would bend over backwards to do things for him.
She had more faith in me than sometimes my parents did.
But what happens next is probably the last thing that you would ever expect to happen. Mason had run out of chances to appeal his conviction, and he had given up trying to fight for his innocence. And so finally, he comes forward and suddenly said that he's guilty. His parents didn't know what to make of this sudden change. They believed that if he had done it, that it had been a mistake. But here were still so many unanswered questions. How did Mason get a gun? And how did it get into their house?
I couldn't get it around my head that my son would kill, our son would kill our daughter. So I was on denial until it was proven in my head that in fact he did pull the trigger and he did kill in the form of an accident.
While Brian and Leslie could accept that Mason killed Jennifer on accident, why wouldn't he have at least tried to get her some medical attention?
We also thought it was a bit strange that he would leave his sister. We would have expected a 911 call. Obviously, I also understand the panic. We feel badly that he certainly didn't do a 911 call.
For many years, neither Leslie or Brian would ever ask their son for details regarding what happened that fateful night. While some details would come out in court, they would never actually discuss what had happened face to face with their son until they came together to film a documentary.
Basically what happened was I came down the stairs. I had the rifle at the coat rack. I put the rifle on top of the coat rack. I hit the rifle and the rifle went forward. When I grabbed the weapon went off. And that's the initial shot. So after that, there was a series of, I checked for a pulse. There was no pulse. She wasn't breathing. Any of that. And there's things that I don't want to discuss, and there's things that I don't want to, I choose not to remember.
The way Mason acted after Jennifer was shot was probably one of the most shocking parts of this case. After shooting her, he moved her from the chair she had been sitting in and dragged her to the basement, showing little regard for the person he supposedly loved. In fact, you could even see the trail of red he made while dragging her. Mason's admission would take a toll on his father, who was already quite ill. After losing his daughter, he lost a substantial amount of weight, developed diabetes and other health problems, and became a shell of his old self.
How in heck would that kind of love be a murder thing within a week?
The other question remains, if Mason killed his sister on accident, then how could she possibly have been shot so many different times? His response to this question is so callous, it will probably not only shock, but enrage you.
My story was that there was more than one intruder and something like that, so it would look more like a gang type.
So they would all come in and each one would shoot her? Like four shots, like here, your turn, your turn, your turn?
No, I don't know.
Mason maintains a relationship with his parents and lives a life that is better than what most accused killers get to enjoy. His cell is more like a dorm room, and he even gets weekend visits with his parents. He also gets to phone them frequently. In one phone call, he expressed to his father the sadness that he realized that once his parents were gone, he would have no one left, now that his sister is already dead.
Mom always said, after you guys are gone, that we'll have each other. And now I think about, well, when you guys are gone, I won't have anybody.
In the years following Mason's conviction, police would eventually have to break the news to his parents that they feared that Jennifer might not have been Mason's only target that night. Not to sound cold or callous, but Jennifer was on that carpet for one reason, and one reason only, and that is to keep her from being seen from the next person that comes in that door. Officers explained to Leslie, suggesting that she probably could have been his next target. They would go on to suggest that it was possible that Mason had plans to exterminate each and every one of his family members that night. This is something that his parents currently deny that they believe would have never ever happened. Things get even more confusing when police discover what seems to be a written draft of Mason's parents' will that just so happened to be left out on the table that night that Jennifer died. It claimed that if both Leslie and Brian were to die, all of their money was to go to Mason. This added to how guilty he looked, not to mention that Jennifer was killed just 12 days after Mason was arrested from jail for a theft charge.
It's a will and testament from me, which is totally not right. It's not from me. I didn't write this piece of garbage, and that's not my signature.
If you think Mason has at this point finally told the whole and total truth about what he's done, you'll be surprised by what he's still allegedly holding back. Little did his family know or understand what a monster it was that they were dealing with. An important detail Leslie seemed to have overlooked from that night that Jennifer died was that Mason called her after he had allegedly killed Jennifer. He asked what time she was going to be home.
That's a very telling piece of information because he's now waiting for his second victim. And that's when he finds out that mom and dad are coming home together. And that changes his plans. Because he cannot shoot two people walking in that door at the same time with a single shot .22 rifle.
Could it be that the only reason Leslie is still alive today is because she had arrived home at the exact same time as her husband? What are his parents now to do with horrific and disturbing information after they stood by Mason all of this time?
When we found out that he had intent to kill us all, that meaning Jennifer, his mother, and his father, it was clear. It was clearer than ever before.
Strangely, for some reason, Mason didn't expect this information to be particularly upsetting to his parents.
It's not going to be shocking, I don't think, for me to say that, yes, I did plan to kill you at one point.
Finally, after all of these years, Mason was able to provide at least a somewhat believable motive for why he wanted to kill his entire perfectly loving family.
I was failing at life. I was failing. I didn't feel that I was being successful. I saw all my friends moving on and moving forward. I felt like a failure. And then my parents would say stuff over the phone that would sort of tick me off. And it was at that point that the thought had entered into my head. Well, one way of dealing with the problems is to kill them.
He believed that this would give him the money to be able to have a fresh start in life. Now, after finally finding out the truth of what had happened that fateful night and what their son intended to do, both Leslie and Brian chose to make the difficult decision to forgive him and offer him their support anyway. Their visits with him take place in a trailer within the prison where he will likely live out the rest of his days. But for them, this is as good as it will ever get again. This story is particularly horrific, not only because the victim was so young, vulnerable, and defenseless, but because the killer was also very young at the time. This case is hard to wrap your head around because it's almost impossible to believe that this type of evil could occur at such a young age. It also looks at the bond a mother has with a child and how much a mother is truly capable of forgiving. Charity Lee is a hardworking single mom of 2 from Albine, Texas. She worked long shifts at Buffalo Wild Wings to help provide for her children, which included 13-year-old Paris and 4-year-old Ella. Charity loved her children and wanted to give them a great life.
I remember being like, oh my God, you can love 2 people this much? Just how is it even possible? I mean, I loved my children fiercely.
The year was 2007 and Charity had been asked to pick up an extra shift at the restaurant. It was the Super Bowl weekend, so it was bound to be busy. As far as she knew, it was just a normal day. Her plans consisted of going to work and then returning home to her children. Meanwhile, another mother of 2 was starting her day working as a police detective for the local county. When she got a call, she was expecting it to be no big deal. Probably just someone acting drunk and disorderly because of the Super Bowl. But in reality, it was anything but. In fact, for Detective Debbie Glenn, it would ultimately be the toughest, most heart-wrenching case she would ever have to work on. And it all started with a 911 call.
Abilene 911.
Hello?
Abilene 911, go ahead.
I was hallucinating.
You were hallucinating?
Yes. I woke up and I thought she was a demon and I killed her.
Knowing only minimal information about the situation, Detective Glenn set off to the address where the crime allegedly occurred. Nothing could prepare her from what she was about to see. This is an area of Texas where serious crimes like this rarely occur. It's a place where the lives of many residents include hard work, watching football, and going to church on Sundays. It's not the place where brutal slayings occur. When Detective Glenn got to Charity's house, there was gore everywhere. In fact, she's never been able to get the mental image of what she saw out of her mind.
I still see her lying on the floor. It was gruesome. It was awful.
Who's the her she's referencing? You'll soon find out, and it is guaranteed to send a shiver down your spine. It was a bedroom. There was a lot of blood on the right side of the bed by the headboard, Detective Glenn recalled. There was also a weapon, a kitchen knife lying on the bed. Also on the bed was Ella Bennett, Paris's adorable little half-sister. She was a little girl who loved butterflies and adored the color purple. She had been slain with a knife by Paris himself, the person who was supposed to love and protect her. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on, Charity's at work, rushing around and serving customers. When she had left the house earlier that day, she had left her children in the care of a babysitter. She didn't know that the babysitter had gone home early, nor did she know that while she was working, police were swarming her house. She especially didn't know that her only daughter had been attacked. But then she got a call that changed her life. It's from the police.
The very first thing they said to me was, they said Ella's been hurt. Well, as a parent, if you think your child's been hurt, what's the first thing you want to do?
So
leave.
Yeah.
He'll take me to where she is now. You just told me Ella was hurt.
While still processing this horrific information, Charity's mind naturally goes to her other child out of concern for him. She asks where Paris is and is told that the police have Paris and that he is the one that killed Ella. That's when everything stopped making sense, Charity said. Despite being warned by the police how savagely Ella had been wounded, Charity demanded to see her body. She needed to see her in order to accept that she was no longer alive.
They unzipped the bag to right under her chin, and I just remember screaming, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I wasn't there." And I remember kissing her and having her in my mouth and what that tasted like.
After a horrific night and while still processing the death of her daughter, she was then expected to come into the police station to answer questions about Paris. She would also see her son face to face for the first time since he killed Ella. Her first emotion was not anger.
Very cold. And when I saw him, the only thing I felt was so happy to see my child, because he was the only one left. I started hugging him and just cried forever. And then I realized at some point that he wasn't hugging me back at all.
It was as if the son Charity thought she knew was gone and had been replaced by someone else. He not only laughed at his mother's tears, but seemed to taunt her, the way that only a psychopath could.
He said to me, "You always said that you would never be able to kill somebody unless they hurt one of your children. So what are you gonna do now?"
Paris didn't even seem scared or sorry for what he had done. Despite the pain she was in, Charity decided she was going to continue to love and stand by her son. The trial against Paris was long and horrific, and Detective Glenn was tasked with finding out whether or not Paris really was having hallucinations on the night he killed Ella. It was possible, as his father himself had paranoid schizophrenia. But on the other hand, some things weren't adding up. Within a 6-hour period, he'd already had 3 different stories, she explained. Eventually, investigators finished with Ella's autopsy, and Charity is informed that her daughter was impaled 17 times. Shocked and horrified, she decided to confront Paris about this.
I was like, "I don't believe you anymore. I think you killed your sister on purpose."
To this, Paris only laughed and called her stupid. It was now that Charity realized that her son was incredibly deranged. Later that year, Paris was convicted for killing Ella. He was given 40 years in prison. Today, Charity believes her son killed intentionally. She also acknowledges that meets the definition of a true psychopath. If you think this case is already as horrific as it could get, it actually gets worse. After some tests were conducted, it was determined that Paris not only brutally killed Ella, but also took advantage of her body before doing so. This is something that years later, he not only admitted to his mother, but gets into full detail about. At this point, most people wouldn't have blamed Charity for leaving her son to rot in prison and never visiting him again. But somehow she still finds it in her heart to forgive him and help make sure he gets the mental help he needs to get better. But that doesn't mean she believes he should be released. And in fact, Paris, now an adult, agrees.
I'm glad to have been sent to prison because I feel that being here has given me time to peer very deeply into the darkest corners of my mind. And I think that had I not come here, I would not be happy with the man that I would eventually grow into.
He doesn't argue that he is mentally unstable or that remorse is not something that comes easy to him. His relationship with his sister was complicated. He had struggled to accept that he would not be the only child anymore.
I'm not the only sibling who's ever struggled with resentment and jealousy.
He also attributes part of what he did as an act of revenge due to anger towards his mom for struggling with a substance addiction. Charity has been in recovery for a long time from substance use, but relapsed around a year before Ella's death. Paris was aware that she was using. She has since managed to recover. Today, while Paris remains behind bars, Charity works as a mental health advocate. She realizes that she can't change the past, but maybe she can change the future.
I can't change Paris today, but maybe by doing this, I can help with changing somebody else's child.
This story is a little bit different because the victims involved weren't actually the killer's real siblings. But this story is so horrific, we thought it worth mentioning. Bibba Henry and Nicole Smallman were two twin sisters in their mid-20s from London, England. Bibba was a social worker while Smallman worked as a freelance photographer. Bibba was to be celebrating her birthday in June of 2020. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic was raging on at the time, making it difficult for them to have much of a party. But because they would not be able to gather inside, the girls decided to hold the party at a public park. There was going to be music, fairy lights, and the whole night was supposed to be magical. What the girls didn't know was that while they enjoyed their celebration in the park, a creepy stranger was watching them the whole time. His name was Daniel Hewson. While the girls were setting up for the party, Daniel, who was 18 years old, had left his father's house and headed towards the park. He went there with only dark intentions. In fact, Daniel had literally made a deal with the devil. He had a demonic pact, and he believed that if he followed through with it, he would be gifted with power. Part of Daniel's pact involved sacrificing a certain amount of women, building a temple for the devil, securing a certain amount of money, and never ever getting caught. It was dark, it was sinister, and it was most definitely insane. And scariest of all, Daniel truly believed his deal was made with true evil characters. The very last picture taken of the two sisters is a bit fuzzy. It appears to show them dancing with fairy lights. Unfortunately, this would be one of the last moments the sisters would enjoy together before being brutally attacked by Daniel.
I don't need to detail the ferocity of the attack. Needless to say, it was, in the prosecution's words, shocking savagery. The sisters stood no chance. Their bodies were dragged into the undergrowth, only to be found by a search party of friends and family.
It was early in the morning, and as security footage shows, his hands were clearly injured. This injury likely occurred as a result of the twins trying to fight him off. The next morning, Daniel would have to go to the hospital to have other wounds associated with the attack treated. This included slashes to his hand. When people asked him how he had gotten these injuries, he claimed he was mugged, and police believed him, at least at first. Police would eventually be able to determine that the knife that Daniel would eventually use to kill the twins was bought by him recently. In fact, this store footage was recent. Those that went to school with Daniel recognized that he had a dark energy.
We knew him to be a Satanist. He had a sinister energy about him,
said one student. But that wasn't the only complaint against him. Daniel was a very jealous person. He stalked my friend to the point where she would see him while walking home, another person said. It wouldn't be long before Daniel would be arrested while at home. After being brought into custody, Daniel would claim that he was not only confused and scared, but also on the autism spectrum. Police didn't believe him, and he would eventually be charged with 2 counts of murder. Today, we remember our girls as the wonderful, strong women they were, and we hope some good news will come out of this horrible story, the girl's mother told the press. Today, Daniel will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Police would eventually determine that this wasn't just his killer's victims, that would go on to try to get justice for those in prison.
Halloween has always been my favorite time of year, ever since I was a kid. My family has had a tradition of throwing a kick-ass Halloween party. We bob for apples, eat candy, we drink now, and watch scary movies. But my favorite part has always been the costume contest. Between my 2 brothers and my parents, we always compete to see who has the absolute best costume. My brothers, Tito and Richie, have dominated the competition the last few years. I'll never forget the year Tito showed up as a French maid, or when Richie dazzled everybody as a charming doctor. They never let me forget it when they win, so I was really looking forward to the party this year. Unfortunately, work and issues with my girlfriend had distracted me from being diligent in finding my costume, and I found myself a mere 2 days away from the party, completely costumeless. You know how it is when you wait till the last minute. It's even worse when you have no idea what you want to be yet. I already knew my brothers had snagged their costumes. My dad wouldn't tell me what they were, but he did tell me that they had fought. I wasn't surprised. My brothers were idiots sometimes. Yes, they usually had the best costumes, but I was much more subtle in procuring my own. If only I had any idea what I wanted to be this year. I visited a few stores and went to the mall, but nothing caught my eye. Panic started to set in. Staring blankly into space and wondering how hard I would hit Tito when he won this year, I noticed someone approaching my driver's side. I glanced sideways and was surprised to see a teenage girl gesturing for me to lower my window. She had long blonde hair, blue eyes, and beautiful tan skin. She wore a red cheerleading uniform and, for some reason, was very familiar. I lowered the window and looked at her. Yeah? Mr. Hyde? Don't you remember me? I blinked. Brittany. My dad is George. He works with you in the office. Oh, that's right. How's it going, Brittany? I didn't know you were a cheerleader. Yeah, she rolled her eyes, seemingly annoyed. I came here to shop with my friends after a pep rally. They're dicks, though, and they thought it'd be hilarious to leave me here and make me walk home. Do you mind giving me a ride? I hesitated. This was my coworker's daughter. If anyone saw her getting into my car, I glanced around the parking lot, making sure there was no one around. I shrugged. All right, hop in. She beamed. Oh, thanks, Mr. Hyde. Brittany was resilient. I've tailored a lot of costumes, but she lasted much longer than most people do. I'd already flayed her arms and legs and cheeks before she finally faded away. I made quick work of the rest of her and started the sewing process. Thank goodness I'm a small guy. Tito and Richie would have never fit into this costume. I showed up at my parents' place in a woman's skin for the first time since I was a teenager. I've been a librarian, a homeless man, even a dentist. I regret killing Dr. Stanley, but none of them have been impressive enough. This